Hello my crafty peeps, it's Cheyenne from ecdesignstudios.com. Today's Tip and Technique Tuesday will be another heat emboss technique. This is going to be the watercolor lift. So what we're going to be using is a piece of shimmer white cardstock. You could also use watercolor paper for this. Shimmer white and watercolor, they take the water a lot better than a regular cardstock. You're able to do a lot more with it. The watercolor paper will take the most water, so there'll be the less damage to the actual fibers of the cardstock. Alright, you're also going to need Versamark, Embossing Buddy, Stampin' Up! Clear Emboss ink. Going to need a aqua painter water brush, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to be using the Petite Petals stamp set. I'm going to be using this one down here. It kind of looks like watercolors. I think it's going to fare well with this technique, but any stamp set you want to use, as long as it's got thick enough lines or there's enough solidness, and you'll see what I mean. Alright, I'm also going to be watercoloring with my ink pads. I'll be using Flirty Flamingo, Sweet Sugar Plum, and Peekaboo Peach. These are all the 2016 to 2018 in colors. Well, it's from that bundle. So let's get started, shall we?
Okay, first thing we're going to do is squeeze our Stampin' pads, get some of that ink onto the lid, and this is going to become your palette. I love that you can do this with the Stampin' Up! Ink pads. You really get your money's worth because there's so much more you're able to do with them. You're going to make sure that your aqua brush is primed with water, and then you're just going to make a nice watercolor wash on the background. Start out light. You can always build up intensity. Let the layers dry fully in between so that you can really get the intensity without making the colors too muddy. If they mix up too much, it will get like brown and black, and unless that's the look you're going for, then you just steer clear. Be aware of the colors that you are putting next to each other, because where they meet, they're going to make a third color. So just keep that in mind. To dry your piece, watercolors tend to dry pretty fast to begin with, but if you can't wait for it to air dry, you can use a heat tool. If you have a look that you want and you want to lock it in, go ahead and use a heat tool if you have one available, or a blow dryer. That'll work too. The blow dryer there's a little bit more airflow, so it can move around if there's a lot of water on the surface. Just keep that in mind. The heat tool, there's not a whole lot of that. It's just heat going at it. Yeah, I opted to use a heat tool for time reasons mostly. Usually I prefer to air dry, but if I'm in a hurry, I'll just use the heat tool. Your project has to be fully dry before we move on to this next part with the embossing. If there's any wetness, the embossing powder might stick to it. Tap your embossing buddy over your surface. It's going to help the embossing powder to just be where you want it to be. Take whatever stamp you have. We're using that flower from Paper Papillon, and we're just going to stamp it over with the Versamark. Versamark has about a 10-minute working window before it dries, so you can do it all the way. Sometimes it's hard to see where you're stamping, so you can use the embossing powder to kind of see where the pattern is, so that you're not going over it too much. Sprinkle on your embossing powder, tap off and save the excess. You know, these are very economical. Embossing powders, you get a lot of embossing out of them before they're finally done. I have embossing powders that I've had for years because you use so little for each project. Now, once we get everything, all the embossing powder, we're going to use our heat tool, and we're going to melt it in. Let your heat tool warm up for 20 to 40 seconds before going and putting it on your project. It helps to prevent burning, and that's all there is to that. Don't overheat your embossing powder. You know, it'll get this nice shiny look to it, and then you just stop. You stop at that point. Let it cool for a couple seconds so that you don't smudge it. and you know it is hot, so be aware. You can also, before you start heat setting it, take the time to use a brush and kind of wipe off and clean off any that has gone astray. If the corner of your block has hit the edge, go ahead and clean up that line. Once the embossing powder is set, now it's the fun part. We are going to essentially drown our paper in water and lift up the watercolor part of it. So I'm just using a spray bottle, spraying down this piece of paper, getting it really wet, and then I am just lifting it up, lifting that color up with a paper towel. What is underneath the embossing powder will stay just as it was, but you're lightening up what's around it, that negative space. You're lifting the color out of it, and it's just going to make those flowers pop. The background will still have a little bit of color to it. You'll never be able to get it completely back to white, but it's going to be a lot lighter. You can see there you get that lovely watercolor effect underneath the flowers. Isn't that gorgeous? Like, I love this effect. Now I'm using my heat tool to speed up the process. When you're doing this over embossed images, just be aware that you do not want to overheat the embossing powder. So keep it moving, you know, front and back, flip it back and forth, and just be careful. You know, once this is all done, once it's dry, that's it. This is the finished project. You get some nice shimmer and shine from the embossing and that beautiful watercolor background. It's nice, it's soft. You know, you can do so much with this. Put it in Project Life, make a card out of it. I think it's gorgeous. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please remember to like and subscribe. A full list of the products I used will be linked in the coordinating blog post, which will be in the description bar below. There will also be a nice gallery of all the products that will link directly to my online website. Thank you again, and happy crafting!